My name is Vivian Ashford. I am 39 years old. I manage private estates and family trusts for a living, and for my entire life my family believed I was the poor one. They had reasons to think it, and I let them. I drove an old car. I wore the same coat for years. I never talked about money, because in my profession you learn very early that the people who talk about money are usually the ones who don't have it, and the people who have it never say a word. My family mistook my silence for lack. They mistook my plain coat for poverty. And at every gathering, for 20 years, I was the poor relation, the one they seated at the end of the table, the one whose birthday gift was always a little smaller, the one my mother apologized for to strangers. Vivian does something with paperwork, she'd say, in the tone you'd use for a daughter who hadn't quite launched. My younger sister Camille was the success. She married well, or at least loudly. She had the big house with the payments to match, the car she couldn't quite afford, the life that looked expensive from the outside and was held together with credit on the inside. But it looked right, and looking right was the family currency, so Camille was the golden one and I was the poor one, and everyone agreed on this so completely that they never once thought to check. Then our grandmother died. And at the will reading, in a lawyer's office with the whole family assembled, my sister leaned over to me, while we were still waiting for the lawyer to begin, and patted my knee, and said, "Warm as anything, don't worry, Vivi. Whatever Grandma left, I'll make sure you get a little something. I know things are tight for you." I thanked her. I actually thanked her. Because my sister did not know the one thing that was about to reorganize her entire understanding of our family. She didn't know that our grandmother's estate, the house, the land, the accounts, all of it, had been in a trust for the last 11 years. And she didn't know who had been quietly managing that trust the entire time, protecting it, growing it, keeping it whole through every one of Camille's small loans that Grandma quietly said no to. It was me. I owned the estate, in every way that mattered. I had for over a decade. Before I tell you what the lawyer said when he opened the folder, and what my sister's face did when she finally understood who the poor relation actually was, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether you've ever let people believe you had less than you did. I want to see how far this story travels. I have to explain what I do, because it's the whole spine of this story, and it's the exact thing my family found too dull to ever ask about. I manage estates and family trusts. When a family has real money, old money, quiet money, the kind that doesn't announce itself, someone has to protect it across generations. Someone has to structure it so it survives taxes, and lawsuits, and the one relative in every family who'd drain it dry if they could reach it. That's what I do. I'm the person who sits between a family's wealth and the forces that would erode it, and I'm good at it precisely because I understand something most people never learn, that real wealth is quiet, and the moment it gets loud, it starts to disappear. My family found this incomprehensible. Paperwork, my mother called it. Camille called me the file clerk when she was feeling generous and worse when she wasn't. At family dinners, when the subject of money came up, and in my family it always came up, I stayed silent, and my silence was read as embarrassment, as the poor sister who couldn't contribute to the conversation about renovations and vacations and cars. I could have contributed more than any of them. I simply chose not to, because I had spent my career watching families destroy themselves the moment they started measuring each other by what showed. Here is the thing my family never understood about me, the thing that turned out to matter more than anything. I was raised by my grandmother, not really by my mother. And my grandmother was the quiet money kind. She had grown up with real wealth and watched half of it evaporate in a single generation because her own siblings couldn't stop performing it, buying boats and houses to prove they had it until they didn't. She learned the lesson young, and she taught it to exactly one person in our family. Me. Let me tell you about my grandmother, because you can't understand the will reading without understanding her. Eleanor Ashford was the richest person my family had, and the only one who never looked it. She lived in the same house for 50 years, a large old house on a lot of land, worth a fortune by the end simply because the city had grown around it, but she never sold, never flaunted, never mentioned it. She drove a sensible car. She clipped coupons, not because she needed to, but because she said the day you stop respecting a dollar is the day it stops respecting you. My family thought she was just a frugal old woman with a nice house. They had no idea what she was actually sitting on, because she'd spent 60 years making sure it never showed. She saw herself in me. That was the whole thing. When I was a girl, while Camille was performing for the adults in the living room, I'd be in the kitchen with Grandma, and she'd show me how she kept her books, how she thought about money as something you steward rather than something you spend, how the loudest person in any room about money was always the one with the least of it. I didn't know I was being trained. I thought I was just spending time with the one person in my family who seemed to actually see me. When I went into estate management, my grandmother was the only one who understood why. Everyone else thought I'd taken a dull job pushing paper. Grandmother knew I'd taken up the family's real work, the quiet work of protecting what matters from the people who'd fritter it away. And so, 11 years before she died, when her health first gave her a scare, she did something she told no one about except me and her lawyer. She put everything, the house, the land, the accounts, the whole quiet fortune, into a trust. And she named me as the trustee. Not the beneficiary of a handout. The steward of the entire thing. She trusted me, of everyone in the family, to protect what she'd spent a lifetime quietly building. They'll all think you're the poor one, she told me, the day we signed it, with a small smile. Let them. The poor one is the safest person in any family. Nobody guards their money from the person they think has none. I want to be fair to my family, because fairness is the whole point of this story. They were not evil. They were performers, raised in a family that measured worth by display, and they'd simply never been taught any other way to see. Camille genuinely believed she was the successful one, because she had the house and the car and the life that photographed well. She didn't know those things were mortgaged to the edge. In her mind, she was winning, and I was the sad, quiet sister she felt sorry for, and her pity was, I have to be honest, mostly sincere. She wasn't being cruel when she offered to make sure I got a little something. She thought she was being generous. She thought she was the strong one looking out for the weak one. That's what made it land the way it did. My family didn't decide I was poor out of malice. They decided it out of a complete inability to imagine that quiet could mean anything but lack. And for 20 years I let them, because my grandmother was right. The person everyone thinks has nothing is the safest person in the room. There were 3 moments I never let myself feel until the will reading made me feel all of them at once. When I was 26, I paid off a medical bill that would have crushed my mother, anonymously, through a structure she never traced, and I listened for years afterward as she told people how lucky she'd been that the hospital made an error in her favor. When I was 31, Camille needed a loan she'd never repay, and came to me last, almost as an afterthought. Sure, I couldn't help, and I quietly declined, not because I couldn't, but because grandmother had taught me that a loan to someone like Camille isn't help, it's fuel. And when I was 35, at a family dinner, my mother pointed at my old coat and said, gently, in front of everyone, we should all chip in and get Vivian something nice this year. The table murmured in agreement. I said thank you. I was, at that moment, managing more money than everyone at that table would earn in their combined lifetimes. I said thank you, and I meant it, because my grandmother had taught me that the last laugh is the only one worth saving up for. Grandmother died on a Tuesday, in the house she'd lived in for 50 years, with me holding her hand, because I was the one who came on weekdays. Camille came on the last day, with flowers, and cried beautifully, and everyone comforted her. That was the shape of us, right to the end. The will reading was the following week, in the office of grandmother's lawyer, a careful man named Harold Bishop who had known her for 40 years and known me for 11. The whole family came, because the whole family assumed there was money. They just assumed it was a house and some savings, a nice inheritance to be divided, enough to matter but nothing that would change the family's understanding of itself. Camille arrived like she was arriving at her own coronation. She'd already, I later learned, told her husband that Grandma's house alone would solve everything, meaning the debts she'd never told anyone about. She had spent, in her head, money she did not have, on the assumption that she'd inherit a share of an estate she didn't understand. She sat down beside me, radiant and grieving in the way only Camille could manage simultaneously, and she patted my knee, and she offered to make sure the poor sister got a little something. And Harold Bishop opened his folder, and he looked around the room, and he said, before I read the distribution, I need to explain the structure of the estate, because most of you are not aware of it. I watched my family lean forward, and I watched Camille's face, already composing itself into the gracious expression of someone about to inherit, and I sat very still, because I have learned that the person who reacts is the person the room decides to manage, and I was about to stop being managed for the first time in my life. Harold explained it plainly, the way grandmother would have wanted. He explained that 11 years earlier, Eleanor Ashford had placed the entirety of her estate, the house, the land, the investment accounts, all of it, into an irrevocable trust. He explained that the estate was considerably larger than anyone in the room appeared to understand, and he named a number, and I watched my family's faces change, because the number was not a nice inheritance number. It was a generational wealth number. It was a number that meant our quiet, coupon-clipping grandmother had been, the entire time, the richest person any of them had ever personally known. The room made a sound. Camille made a sound. And then Harold said the part that stopped all the sounds. He explained that the trust had been actively managed for the last 11 years by a single trustee, appointed by Eleanor herself, who had protected and grown the estate through more than a decade, and that upon Eleanor's death, per the terms she had set, the trust would continue under that same trustee's control, with distributions to family members to be made at the trustee's discretion, according to a set of principles Eleanor had written herself. Camille asked the question the whole room was thinking. Who's the trustee? And Harold Bishop looked at me, over his glasses, the way he'd looked at my grandmother for 40 years, and he said, Vivian is. She has been since the beginning. Your grandmother named her the day she created the trust. I want to describe what my sister's face did, because I'd waited 20 years to see it, and I want to be honest that seeing it was not what I expected. It did not fill with rage. It filled with confusion, and then with a kind of horror, and then with the slow, dawning collapse of an entire understanding of the world. Because Camille was not just learning that Grandma was rich. She was learning that I, the poor sister, the file clerk, the one she'd just offered a little something to out of pity, had been the quiet holder of the family's real wealth for 11 years. That every time she'd pitied me, I'd known. That every time she'd performed her success at me, I'd been managing more than she'd ever see. That the woman she'd patted on the knee 90 seconds ago controlled whether she inherited anything at all. She looked at me, and she said, in a very small voice, You knew? This whole time, you knew? And I said, gently, because I did not need to be cruel, I knew. Grandma asked me to protect it. So I did. Here is where the story becomes a choice, and it is not the choice my family expected, and it is probably not the one you'd expect either. Because I held everything. The trust gave me full discretion. I could have distributed the entire estate to myself, grandmother's terms allowed it. I could have given my mother and my sister exactly what they'd given me for 20 years, which was a little something, a token, a pat on the knee. There would have been a perfect symmetry in it. The poor relation inherits everything and hands the golden family the scraps. After 20 years of that coat, I'd be lying if I said the thought didn't have its own dark gravity. I thought about it. But I kept asking myself what I actually wanted underneath the 20 years, and it was not to make my family poor. It was to no longer be invisible to them. And I already had that, the moment Harold said my name, I had it, permanently. Making Camille destitute wouldn't give me anything the truth hadn't already delivered. It would just make me the villain in the story she'd tell for the rest of her life, and I'd spent too long being quietly good to become loudly cruel in a single afternoon. So I did what my grandmother actually wanted, which was written in the principles she'd left me, and which I'd helped her write. I did not give my family the money. Grandmother was explicit about that, and she was right. A lump sum handed to people who perform wealth would evaporate in 3 years, exactly as her own siblings' fortune had. Camille would have paid down her debts and rebuilt them larger within 18 months. My mother would have given most of hers to Camille. Handing them cash would not have been generosity. It would have been handing an addict the thing they can't hold. Instead, I did the harder thing. I used the trust the way it was meant to be used. I quietly paid off Camille's actual debts, directly, to the creditors, so the money couldn't be respent, which took a weight off her marriage she'd been hiding for years. I set up a modest, structured monthly distribution for my mother, enough to live on comfortably for the rest of her life, that could never be drained in a lump or handed to Camille. I funded education trusts for the grandchildren that Camille couldn't touch. I kept the house, grandmother's house, in the trust, maintained, so it would pass whole to the next generation instead of being sold to cover someone's car payment. I gave my family security. I just refused to give them a fortune to perform with, because the one thing my grandmother trusted me to do was make sure her life's quiet work outlasted the people who'd have turned it loud. The 18 months after that were not dramatic. That's the part these stories never show. Camille did not thank me, at first. It's hard to thank the sister you pitied for 90 seconds before she turned out to hold your whole life in a folder. For months she was cold and humiliated, and I let her be, because humiliation is a thing a person has to walk through on their own. But something shifted when she realized what I'd actually done, that I'd quietly erased the debt she'd been drowning in and telling no one about, that I'd protected her from the collapse she'd been one bad month away from for years. The performance had been exhausting her. And the poor sister she'd pitied had, without a word, taken the weight off her chest. She came to me, close to a year later, and she said, "I spent my whole life feeling sorry for you." And I said, "I know." And she said, "You let me." And I said, "Grandma taught me to." She said the poor one is the safest person in the family. And Camille was quiet for a long time, and then she said, she was protecting it from me. Wasn't she? And I didn't answer, because the truth didn't need me to say it out loud, and because she wasn't really asking. She was finally, at 40, understanding the family she'd grown up in. My mother took longer, because she had the most to unbuild 20 years of apologizing for me to strangers, of the coat comments, of seating me at the end of the table. She never quite said sorry in a clean sentence. But one Sunday she came to grandmother's house, where I was going through the old kitchen, and she stood in the doorway a long time, and she said, "You were in here with her all those years, while the rest of us were in the living room." And I said yes. And she said, "She saw something in you none of us bothered to look for." It wasn't an apology. But it was my mother finally naming the thing she'd missed for a lifetime, and I decided to let it be enough. People ask me whether it was revenge. I didn't take anything from anyone. I didn't perform, or lie, or drain a fortune, or hand my family scraps to punish them. I didn't do a single one of the things the story seems to set up. All I did was exactly what my grandmother asked, protect the quiet thing she'd built, from the people who'd have made it loud and lost it. Here is what everybody lost. Camille lost the story, the one where she was the successful one and I was the sister to pity. She lost it in a lawyer's office, 90 seconds after offering me a little something, and I won't pretend some part of me didn't wait 20 years for that. But she gained something too, which is that the debt that was quietly killing her is gone, and she knows now who made it gone, and she can stop performing a wealth she never had. My mother lost the tidy arrangement, the golden daughter and the poor one. And she's the only one still slowly, honestly reckoning with what that cost her. And I lost something too, and it wasn't the family. I lost the grandmother who was the only person who ever actually saw me. Everything I have, every quiet skill they mocked, came from a woman in a kitchen who decided, when I was small, that of everyone in this loud performing family, the silent girl doing the books was the one worth teaching. I'd have handed all of it back for one more afternoon with her. I keep her coupon organizer on my desk now. Not the trust documents, those are filed where they belong. The coupon organizer, the cheap little accordion folder she carried for 50 years while sitting on a fortune. Because that folder is the truest thing she ever taught me, that the quietest person in the room, the one everyone's decided has the least, is very often the one holding it all together. They treated me like the poor relative for 20 years. It turned out the poor relative was the one my grandmother trusted with everything, precisely because I was the only one who never needed to look rich. So if there's someone in your life the whole family has quietly decided has nothing, who they seat at the end of the table, who they pity, who they'd never think to guard their money from, ask yourself one thing tonight. Do they actually have nothing? Or have they simply learned the oldest quiet lesson there is, that the person who never performs what they have is the only one who gets to keep it? Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Every character and event in it is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. But if any of it felt familiar, I hope it leaves you with this: never measure a person by what they let you see. The loudest wealth is usually the emptiest, and the quiet one at the end of the table, in the old coat, saying nothing about money, that's very often the person who understands it best. Stay quiet. Stay kind. And let them keep underestimating you. It's the safest place to stand.